You're useless. Get out of my house. I can still hear my father's voice cutting through the silence of that birthday dinner 14 years ago, each word landing like a physical blow across the table where my untouched cake sat with its 18 flickering candles. I was 32 now, sitting in my corner office on the 23rd floor overlooking the city. But some memories don't fade. They calcify, becoming part of your foundation whether you want them to or not. That night in June 2009 marked the end of whatever remained of my childhood and the beginning of everything I'd built since. Every achievement constructed on the rubble of my father's rejection. Richard Chen was a self-made man, or so he told anyone who would listen, building Chen Mortgage Solutions from nothing into a thriving business during the housing boom, working 16-hour days and wielding his success like a weapon to remind everyone around him of their comparative inadequacy. To him, only real work mattered: his work, his business, his way of measuring human worth through profit margins and deal closings. My mother had been the buffer, the warm center of our home who could soften his sharp edges and make me feel seen even when he looked right through me. But she'd died when I was 12, and within a year he'd remarried Linda, who brought her 15-year-old son Brett into our house like a replacement family, complete with golden child ready-made. I'd graduated high school with honors just weeks before that birthday dinner, my acceptance letter to the State University's computer science program tucked in my bag like a lottery ticket I couldn't cash, because my father had made his position crystal clear over the previous months. College is a waste of money for a girl who'll just get married anyway. I'd asked him one final time that night, sitting across from him and Linda and Brett, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the scholarship that would cover half the tuition, the financial aid that might cover more, how I just needed help with the remaining $7,000 for the first year, how I'd work part-time and pay him back every cent. His face had darkened with each word, that familiar storm cloud gathering behind his eyes, and when I finished, he'd set down his fork with deliberate precision and delivered his verdict. I was entitled. I was a burden. I'd been given everything and appreciated nothing. And most of all, most unforgettably, I was useless. He'd stood from the table, pulled $200 bills from his wallet, thrown them at me, and told me to pack my things and be gone within the hour. I remembered standing on the sidewalk outside my childhood home that night, duffel bag at my feet, watching the lights go off in the house room by room until only Brett's window glowed, and thinking with a clarity born of shock that I would never be useless again, that I would prove every cruel word wrong even if he never lived to see it. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern of mistreatment hadn't started with that birthday dinner. It had roots that went back years, twisted deep into the soil of our family's history. Growing wild and poisonous after my mother died in 2002 when I was 12 years old. Before her death, my father had been demanding but not cruel, busy but not absent, and she'd been the one who made our house feel like a home, who remembered my science fair projects and braided my hair and told me I could be anything I wanted to be. After the funeral, after we'd buried her in the cemetery on the hill where the wind never stopped blowing, my father had thrown himself into expanding Chen Mortgage Solutions with a manic intensity that felt like drowning, working 16-hour days as the housing boom built toward its peak. And within a year, just 1 year, he'd brought Linda home and announced they were getting married. This woman with her tight smile and her 15-year-old son Brett, who looked at our house like he was measuring it for new curtains. Everything changed after that, the favoritism so blatant it would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so devastating. Brett got a new BMW for his 16th birthday, while I was told the bus was perfectly adequate transportation. Brett went to Riverside Prep, the private school across town with its manicured lawns and college counselors, while I stayed at Lincoln High working 20 hours a week at the public library to buy my own clothes, because the family budget somehow never included me. My father paid for Brett's SAT tutors, his travel hockey league, his summer camps at prestigious universities, while my interest in computers was dismissed with a wave of his hand and the words, "That's boy stuff." Maya, focus on practical skills like cooking and organization. I remembered coming home at 16, practically vibrating with excitement because I'd won the regional coding competition, beating out students from schools with actual computer labs and teachers who understood programming, and I'd found my father in his study going over mortgage documents. "Dad, I won," I'd said, holding up the certificate like it was made of gold, and he'd barely looked up from his papers, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. "That's nice. Did you finish the laundry?" Those 4 words had somehow hurt more than all his yelling ever could. Brett failed 2 classes his junior year, and my father hired expensive tutors and blamed the teachers for not recognizing his stepson's unique learning style. While I maintained a 3.9 GPA while working 20 hours a week and received nothing but criticism for the occasional A-. Linda actively undermined me at every turn, moving me from my childhood bedroom to the smallest room in the house to make space for Brett's gaming setup, forgetting to include me in family photos, serving my favorite meals on nights when I had to work late and couldn't be home for dinner. Nothing I did was ever good enough. Every achievement dismissed with, "That's nice, but Brett made varsity," or "That's fine. But did you clean the bathroom like I asked?" The 2 weeks I spent at Jessica's house after that birthday night were a blur of shock and survival instinct, sleeping on the Chen family's worn couch in their small living room while Mrs. Chen kept trying to feed me and muttering in Mandarin about what kind of father throws out his own daughter. Jessica's mother was horrified by what my father had done, kept hugging me and saying I could stay as long as I needed. But I knew I was intruding on their cramped 2-bedroom apartment where Jessica already shared a room with her younger sister. And besides, I couldn't bear to be anyone's burden. Couldn't prove my father right about me being useless and dependent. I found a room in a boarding house on the east side of town, the kind of neighborhood where you heard sirens every night and didn't make eye contact with the people smoking on the corner. $450 a month for a space barely big enough for a twin bed and a desk, with a shared bathroom down the hall that I had to remember to wear shoes in because the floor was never quite clean. I got a job waiting tables at Morrison's Diner, the 24-hour place near the highway where truckers and night shift workers came for coffee and pie, working 50 to 60 hours a week on my feet until my legs ached and my smile felt permanently plastered on, pocketing tips in 1s and 5s that smelled like grease and cigarette smoke. I enrolled at Metro Community College part-time using Pell Grants and student loans, taking computer science classes at night after my dinner shift ended, sitting in the back of classrooms at 9 p.m., still wearing my waitress uniform because I didn't have time to change, living on ramen noodles and instant oatmeal, and never buying clothes that weren't from thrift stores. After a month of silence, I sent my father a single text message. "I'm okay. In college, working." His response came 3 hours later. "Good. Time you learned responsibility." That was it. No birthday acknowledgement when I turned 19 in June. No Christmas call. No check-in to see if I was alive or dead or sleeping in my car. Jessica reported back to me like a spy behind enemy lines. Brett got a brand new Mustang for his high school graduation, bright red with a custom sound system, and my father was paying for Brett's entire college tuition at the state university, even though Brett had received partial scholarships, because his boy deserved the full college experience without having to work. I felt like a ghost, erased from the family as completely as if I'd never existed. My room repurposed as Linda's craft space according to Jessica. My photos removed from the mantle. Thanksgiving, 2009. I worked the morning shift at the diner, then sat alone in a corner booth during my break, eating a turkey sandwich one of the cooks had made for me out of pity, watching families come in with their loud conversations and their children and their casual assumption that they belonged to each other, feeling a hollowness in my chest that was almost physical but also something harder forming underneath it, something like determination, or maybe rage. I made myself a promise sitting there with my cold turkey sandwich and my aching feet. I would prove I wasn't useless. I would build something that mattered, and whether my father ever saw it or not didn't matter because I would know. My first semester, I earned a 4.0 while working full time, and my computer science professor, Dr. Harrison, a kind man with white hair and endless patience, pulled me aside after class one night and said, "You have real talent, Maya. Don't let circumstances make you give up." I didn't tell him that giving up had never been an option, because people who had safety nets could give up, but people like me could only keep climbing. Dr. Harrison's recommendation letter in the spring of 2010 changed everything. His words describing me as one of the most naturally talented programmers I've encountered in 20 years of teaching, opening doors I hadn't known existed. And after 2 years of community college grinding through general education requirements while serving eggs and coffee to pay my rent, I transferred to State University with a partial academic scholarship that covered tuition, but nothing else. The paid internship Dr. Harrison helped me secure was at a tech startup called DataStream Solutions, $15 an hour to write code for their loan processing software, and I took it even though it meant working 30 hours a week at the startup and another 20 waiting tables on weekends, living in the cheapest student housing I could find with 3 roommates who threw parties while I studied at the kitchen table with noise-canceling headphones I'd bought used. There was no social life, no dating, no football games or study abroad programs, or any of the experiences people talked about when they reminisced about college. There was only code and classes and work, and the grim determination to finish what I'd started, to prove that the girl who'd been thrown out with $200 could build something that mattered. I graduated in May 2013 with a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, summa cum laude, 22 years old, with $45,000 in student loans, but a degree in my hand that I'd earned entirely on my own. And DataStream offered me a full-time position as a junior developer at $65,000 a year, more money than I'd ever imagined making. That first real paycheck felt like a miracle, like validation printed on bank paper. And I moved out of student housing into a tiny studio apartment that was mine alone, no roommates, no shared bathroom, just 300 square feet of space where I could breathe without asking permission. I bought myself a laptop that wasn't used, wasn't held together with duct tape and prayers, just a clean new machine that booted up fast and didn't crash. And I sat on my empty floor the day I moved in and cried because I'd made it. I'd actually made it out. Throughout those 4 years of college, I'd had zero contact with my father, not a single call or text or email, as if I'd ceased to exist the moment I walked out his door. And when I graduated, I sent him an announcement with a short note. Graduated with honors. I wasn't useless after all. 3 weeks of silence followed. 3 weeks where I told myself I didn't care, didn't need his acknowledgement, and then a text arrived. Congratulations, your mother would be proud. Not I'm proud. Your mother would be proud, as if he couldn't bring himself to claim any feeling of his own, as if my achievement was something he could only view through the lens of my dead mother's hypothetical approval. I didn't respond because there was nothing to say to a man who couldn't even pretend to feel pride in his own daughter. And through Jessica's periodic updates, I heard that Brett had dropped out of State University junior year, no degree, no explanation, and my father had simply given him a job at Chen Mortgage Solutions with the title Vice President of Operations and a 6-figure salary for showing up and playing golf with clients. My first day at DataStream as a real employee, not an intern but a junior developer with business cards and benefits and a 401k, I looked at my employee badge with my photo and my title and felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost hurt, standing in the office bathroom whispering to my reflection, I did this. I did this alone. No one gave me anything. The 3 years at DataStream Solutions from 2013 to 2016 were a masterclass in how talent and relentless work could compound into something bigger than survival, something that looked like actual success, and I threw myself into the code with a fierce joy that surprised me because work had always been necessity, but now it was also passion. I was promoted twice in those 3 years, first to mid-level developer at $78,000, then to senior developer at $95,000 by the time I turned 25, and I discovered I had a particular gift for seeing system architecture, for understanding how complex pieces fit together and finding elegant solutions to problems that made other developers want to tear their hair out. DataStream specialized in software for the financial sector, specifically loan processing automation that helped lenders move faster and more efficiently, and I became the lead developer on our flagship product, working 70-hour weeks, not because anyone forced me, but because I genuinely loved the puzzle of it, the satisfaction of building something that worked beautifully. I paid off $20,000 of my student loans during those years, watching the balance shrink with grim satisfaction. And meanwhile, through Jessica's periodic updates, I heard that my father's company was struggling in the post-recession mortgage landscape, where the industry had fundamentally changed, and old-school brokers who relied on relationships and handshakes were losing ground to tech-forward competitors who could process applications in hours instead of days. Jessica told me Chen Mortgage Solutions revenue was down 40% from peak years, that my father had to let go of staff and take out loans to cover operating expenses, and Brett was still officially employed there as vice president of operations, but mostly seemed to play golf with clients and show up at 11 a.m. My father refused to modernize according to Jessica's reports, called software and automation gimmicks, that removed the human touch from mortgage lending, and I saw the bitter irony that I was literally building the future of the industry he worked in, that DataStream software was being adopted by major lenders across the country while he clung to methods that were becoming obsolete. In the fall of 2015, I was invited to speak on a panel at the National Mortgage Technology Conference in Chicago, and at 24 years old, I was the youngest person on that panel and the only woman, sitting in a hotel ballroom in front of 300 industry professionals giving a presentation on automation and efficiency improvements that could help smaller brokers compete with major banks. After the panel, someone approached me during the networking reception, a mortgage broker from Cleveland with gray hair and a curious expression, and he said, "Your last name is Chen. Any relation to Richard Chen from Chen Mortgage Solutions?" And I froze with my conference coffee halfway to my mouth. "You know him?" I asked carefully, and the man nodded, said, "Old school broker, been in the business 30 years, good guy but doesn't adapt. I heard his company's struggling." And I felt a complex swirl of emotions, vindication that felt like acid, unexpected concern that I immediately pushed away, and something darker that might have been satisfaction. I told the man, "He's my father, but we're not in contact," keeping my voice professionally neutral, and changed the subject. But I thought about that conversation for weeks afterward. Thought about my father dismissing the very technology that could have saved his business, while his daughter became an expert in it. Christmas 2015, my father sent me his first communication in years, a text that said, "Heard you're doing well in tech, good for you." No apology, no acknowledgement of 6 years of silence and abandonment, just casual words like we were acquaintances catching up, and I stared at that message for 10 minutes before deleting it without responding and throwing myself back into work instead, because work was clean and clear and didn't ask anything of me except competence. Spring 2016 arrived with news that DataStream Solutions was being acquired by Apex Financial Services, one of the largest financial technology companies in North America, and suddenly my stock options that had seemed like abstract numbers on paper became real money, $180,000 after taxes, more money than I'd ever imagined having all at once. The acquisition team offered me a position at Apex with a salary of $140,000 plus equity. A generous package that would have meant stability and prestige and a clear upward path. But I could also take the buyout and walk away with cash in hand, And I sat in my apartment for 3 nights running scenarios and calculations and feeling something unfamiliar stirring in my chest that I finally recognized as ambition, not for advancement, but for creation. I'd spent the past 3 years watching the mortgage technology landscape, seeing gaps in the market where small and mid-sized brokers were getting crushed by major banks with sophisticated tech infrastructure, and I'd built relationships with dozens of brokers at conferences who'd told me they needed better tools but couldn't afford enterprise solutions. And I had capital now, real capital, and I knew the technology inside and out, and the possibility of starting my own company felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating in a way that made my hands shake when I thought about it. I took the buyout, $250,000 total after selling my vested options, and in June 2016, at 26 years old, I founded FinFlow Solutions in a tiny rented office in a converted warehouse with 2 developers I'd worked with at DataStream who believed in the vision enough to take a chance on a first-time founder. The first 6 months were absolutely terrifying, watching my savings burn at $5,000 a week for salaries and infrastructure and legal fees and marketing, eating vending machine dinners at 3 in the morning while reviewing code and second-guessing every decision. And I remember one particular night, sitting alone in the dark office, with only the server lights blinking, and thinking about my father's voice saying, "Useless," and laughing bitterly to myself, and whispering, "Building the future of your industry, Dad. Building exactly what you said was a gimmick." Our first client signed in August 2016, a small mortgage company in Houston that took a chance on our platform, then another in Phoenix, then another in Charlotte, and the product worked. It actually worked better than I'd hoped, and word spread through industry networks the way it does when brokers find something that genuinely helps them compete. By the end of 2016, we had 15 clients and we'd broken even. Not profitable, but not dying either. And then 2017 hit and growth exploded because small brokers were desperate for tools that let them process applications as fast as the big banks, and our platform gave them exactly that at a price they could afford. I hired 10 more employees, moved to a real office with a conference room and everything, and at the end of our first full year, we'd brought in $2 million in revenue. And I paid myself a salary of $120,000, modest compared to what I could have taken, but I believed in reinvesting profits into growth. I paid off the remaining $25,000 of my student loans in one payment in December 2017, watching that balance go to zero and feeling something fundamental shift in my chest. And I bought myself a gift, a simple gold necklace with my mother's initial that I wore every day as a reminder of who I'd done this for. There was still no contact with my father, not a word in years, but Jessica told me his company was seriously struggling now, that Brett had somehow lost $200,000 on a deal that fell through and my father had to lay off half his remaining staff. And I felt that complicated tangle of vindication and sadness and pushed it all away to focus on building something that mattered. The years 2018 and 2019 were when FinFlow Solutions stopped being a promising startup and became an undeniable success story, the kind of trajectory that made me wake up some mornings convinced I was still dreaming because this couldn't be real life for the girl who'd eaten ramen in a boarding house for a year. And we grew to 150 clients across 35 states with revenue hitting $8 million in 2018 alone. We closed our Series A funding round in early 2019 with the company valued at $25 million, and I retained 60% ownership, which meant I was a paper millionaire at 28 years old, a phrase that still felt absurd and unreal when I thought about it. And in the spring of 2019, I got an email that made my hands shake. Forbes wanted to feature me in their 30 Under 30 list for finance technology. The interview process was surreal, sitting in a coffee shop with a journalist who asked about my background, and I carefully mentioned overcoming family challenges and being underestimated as a young woman in tech, without naming my father specifically. But anyone who knew our story could read between those lines. The photo shoot happened in our office server room in April, the photographer wanting shots that showed the technology backbone of our operation, and I stood there in professional clothes I'd carefully selected, 28 years old, and confident in a way that felt earned rather than performed. And I couldn't help remembering the 18-year-old version of myself standing on a sidewalk with a duffel bag and $200 thinking her life was over. The article published online in May, with a photo of me that looked like someone else, someone successful and put together, and I felt surreal pride mixed with disbelief that this was actually my life now. 2 hours after the article went live, Jessica texted me, "Your dad saw the article," and my heart started pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. "And?" I typed back with shaking fingers, and Jessica's response made rage flood through my entire body. "He told people at church his daughter is in Forbes. He's taking credit, showing people the article on his phone. He kicked me out. I texted Jessica. He called me useless and threw me away. He doesn't get to claim me now," and I meant every word, but I also felt 10 years of suppressed hurt rising up like acid in my throat. A week later, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in 10 years. My father calling for the first time since I'd sent him my graduation announcement, and I stared at the screen, letting it ring through to voicemail because I couldn't make myself answer. His voicemail message was brief, and his tone was almost entitled, no tremor of apology or acknowledgement of a decade of silence. "Maya, it's Dad. Saw your article. Very impressive. Call me back, we should talk." Like we were casual acquaintances catching up rather than estranged family members with a history of abandonment between us. I deleted the voicemail immediately, but it shook me in ways I didn't want to examine, bringing up old pain I thought I'd buried under layers of success and independence. The next day, he called again, then sent a text. "Maya, I'm your father. Don't ignore me." And I blocked his number with shaking hands and told Jessica, "He threw me away. He doesn't get to pick me back up when I'm successful." Jessica supported me completely, said I didn't owe him anything, and I threw myself back into work as distraction. But while researching industry news a few weeks later, I saw an article that made my stomach drop. Several small mortgage companies were filing bankruptcy as the market consolidated, and only tech-forward companies survived. And one name in the list of struggling firms caught my eye immediately: Chen Mortgage Solutions, with a brief mention of financial difficulties, an outdated business model that felt like reading my own vindication in print. I couldn't stop thinking about that article mentioning Chen Mortgage Solutions, and I told myself it was just professional curiosity about industry trends. But I knew I was lying to myself as I started doing deep research into my father's company, using public records and business databases and industry reports. What I found was a portrait of systematic decline that was almost painful to witness. Revenue had dropped from a peak of $4.2 million annually in 2007 to barely $800,000 in 2018. There were multiple liens filed against the business assets totaling over $300,000, lawsuits from creditors seeking payment on overdue invoices, and the employee count had shrunk from 40 people at the company's height to just 8 remaining staff members according to the most recent filings. My father's company, the business he'd built from nothing and been so proud of that he'd valued it over his own daughter, was dying a slow and undeniable death, and I felt complicated emotions swirling in my chest that I couldn't quite name. Vindication, certainly, that bitter satisfaction of being proven right about the necessity of modernization and technology, but also an unexpected sadness for the younger version of myself, who'd just wanted his approval and recognition and had been thrown away instead. I told myself I didn't care what happened to him or his business, that he'd made his choices and now he could live with the consequences. But I kept researching anyway, kept checking the court filings and business records, like I was watching a car crash in slow motion. November 2019 brought news through Jessica that Brett had been arrested for his third DUI. that my father had to bail him out for $50,000 he probably couldn't afford, and that a mutual friend had seen my father at the courthouse looking destroyed and defeated in a way that apparently shocked everyone who knew him. Jessica told me that my father had said to this friend, his voice breaking, "Everything's falling apart, the business is dying, Brett's a mess, and my daughter won't even speak to me." And my first thought when I heard that was sharp and bitter. "I'm not your daughter, you made that clear when you kicked me out." But my second thought was a small voice of unexpected pity that I immediately pushed away because I couldn't afford to feel sorry for the man who'd called me useless. December 2019 was FinFlow's best year ever, with $12 million in revenue and actual profitability that let me give my employees generous bonuses and throw a holiday party at a nice hotel downtown. And I stood in front of my team giving a toast saying, "We built something amazing together. We helped small businesses compete and survive. We should be incredibly proud." And they applauded, and I felt genuine happiness that felt earned and real. Driving home alone that night with snow falling softly on the windshield, I passed my old neighborhood, and on impulse, I turned down streets I hadn't driven in years, pulling up across from my childhood home and sitting there in the dark with the engine running. The house looked shabby and neglected, with paint peeling from the shutters and the lawn unmaintained under the snow, so different from the pristine home my mother had kept. And I could see my father's car in the driveway and lights on inside. And I sat there for 5 full minutes, remembering my mother baking in that kitchen, and my father before Mom died, when he'd been stern but not cruel. And I shook my head and put the car in drive and whispered to myself, "That's not my home anymore. It never was after Mom died." And I drove away without looking back. January 2020 started with an interruption that made my carefully constructed professional world collide violently with the past I'd worked so hard to leave behind, and I was reviewing Q4 reports in my office on a gray Tuesday afternoon when my receptionist's voice came through the intercom with a question that made my stomach drop. "Maya, there's a Richard Chen here to see you." I stared at the phone for 3 full seconds while my heart hammered against my ribs, and my first instinct was to say no, to have security escort him out, to maintain the boundaries I'd built so carefully. But instead I heard myself say, "Give me 5 minutes, then send him back." And I used those 5 minutes to take deep breaths and straighten my shoulders and transform myself from the abandoned daughter into the CEO who'd built a $25 million company from nothing. When my father walked through my office door, he looked like he'd aged 20 years instead of 10, with gray hair where there'd been black, significant weight loss that made his expensive suit hang loose on his frame, and a defeated posture that was so different from the commanding presence. I remembered that for a moment I almost didn't recognize him, but I stayed behind my desk and didn't stand, and kept my voice cold when I asked, "What do you want?" He looked around my office, taking in the glass walls and the view of the city and the framed Forbes article on my wall, and said, "Maya, you look successful. This is impressive." And I repeated without inflection, "You didn't answer my question. What do you want?" He tried to smile, tried to establish some kind of familial warmth. "I'm your father. I shouldn't need a reason to visit." And I felt ice spread through my chest as I responded, "You're the man who kicked me out 10 years ago. You need a reason." He flinched at that, actually physically recoiled and said, "I was hard on you. I thought you needed tough love." And the rage that had been simmering in my gut for a decade suddenly boiled over as I said coldly, "Tough love? You called me useless. You gave me $200 and threw me out on the street. That's not love of any kind." He shifted uncomfortably and tried a different approach. "I wanted you to learn independence, and look how well you did." And I stood up then, my hands flat on my desk, my voice shaking with fury. "You don't get credit for my success. I did this despite you, not because of you. I did this alone while you gave Brett everything and he threw it all away." My father held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Maya, I made mistakes. I'm trying to—" And I cut him off. "Apologize? Are you actually apologizing? He looked uncomfortable, looked away, and said, I'm saying I could have handled things differently. Which wasn't an apology at all, and I sat back down and said quietly, Get to the real reason you're here. There was a long pause where I watched him gather courage, watched him prepare to ask for what he'd really come for, and finally he said, My business is struggling, I need help. And there it was, the truth beneath the attempted reconciliation. You need money, I said. Not a question, and he shook his head quickly. I need advice, expertise. You understand this tech stuff. You could consult for me, help me modernize. And I stood up again and said one word. No. He tried again. Maya, please. I'm desperate. The business is dying. And I raised my voice. Get out. He looked shocked. I'm your father. And I walked around my desk toward him, my whole body shaking. You stopped being my father when you chose bread over me every single day, when you remarried a year after Mom died and let Linda erase her memory, when you threw me away like garbage. You're a stranger who shares my DNA. Now leave before I call security. My father stood up from the chair in front of my desk, and for a moment, he looked so defeated and diminished that I almost didn't recognize him as the man who'd loomed so large and terrifying in my childhood memories. And he said quietly, I know I failed you, but I'm still your father. That means something. And I was shaking now with the force of emotions I'd kept locked down for a decade as I responded, It means nothing. You made sure of that. He looked at me for 3 long seconds, as if trying to find something to say that would bridge the impossible distance between us. But there was nothing left to say, and we both knew it. So he turned and walked out of my office without another word, and I watched him go, watched his shoulders slump and his steps drag. And for the first time I saw him not as the monster who'd destroyed my sense of worth, but as an old man who'd made terrible choices and was finally facing the consequences. The moment my office door closed behind him, I broke down completely. 10 years of suppressed emotion flooding out as I sobbed into my hands at my desk, crying for the 18-year-old girl with the duffel bag and the 12-year-old who'd lost her mother, and the little girl who'd once believed her father hung the moon, and my assistant knocked tentatively and called through the door, Are you okay? And I pulled myself together enough to say, I'm fine, hold my calls for an hour. I sat in my office for that full hour, processing what had just happened, and the clarity that came was both painful and necessary. My father had never actually apologized, had never said the words, I'm sorry, or acknowledged the full weight of what he'd done to me. He was still entitled enough to think he could show up and ask for help after throwing me away, still unable to take real responsibility for his choices. But I'd also seen his desperation and his fear and his regret, even if he couldn't articulate it properly, and part of me, the daughter I used to be, had wanted so badly to help him, to finally earn his approval even now. I called my therapist and asked, Can you fit me in today? And in that emergency session, I worked through the tangle of emotions, and my therapist asked, What do you want from him? And I said, I wanted him to be proud of me, but he only showed up when he needed something. And she asked, What do you need to heal? And I realized I needed him to acknowledge he was wrong, to really apologize without qualifications or excuses, and he can't even do that. And saying it out loud, I understood with perfect clarity. I'll never get what I need from him. It was grief, sharp and clean, but it was also liberation, because I could finally stop hoping for something that would never come. The next few weeks, I heard nothing from my father, and Jessica reported that his company was getting worse, that a major creditor was filing a lawsuit for $400,000 in unpaid debt. And I told Jessica firmly, not my problem. But I kept checking the public records anyway, watching the slow-motion collapse of Chen Mortgage Solutions, and in February 2020, I saw what I'd known was coming. My father filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection, his company, and his pride, both finally, completely broken. The bankruptcy filing appeared in the public records on February 14th, 2020, and the irony of the date wasn't lost on me as I sat at my desk reviewing the court documents that detailed the complete collapse of Chen Mortgage Solutions, seeing in black and white how my father's company owed creditors nearly $2 million with assets valued at only $400,000, how the business that had been his entire identity and the thing he'd valued more than his own daughter was now being picked apart by lawyers and accountants. I read through the filing 3 times, absorbing every detail. The company had 3 remaining employees, including my father. The office building had been sold 6 months ago, and they were now operating out of a small rented space. Brett was still listed as VP of Operations despite apparently contributing nothing but liability, and my father had personally guaranteed most of the debt, which meant he stood to lose everything, including the house I'd grown up in. I should have felt pure vindication, should have felt that this was justice for the 18-year-old girl he'd thrown away. But instead I felt a complicated tangle of emotions that I couldn't quite sort through. Satisfaction that he was finally facing consequences, grief for the relationship we'd never had, anger that he'd destroyed his own life through stubbornness and pride, and underneath it all a small, traitorous whisper of concern that I immediately tried to suppress. Jessica called me that evening and said, "Did you see?" And I replied, "I saw." And she asked carefully, "How are you feeling about it?" And I said honestly, "I don't know. I thought I'd feel happy, but I just feel empty." She was quiet for a moment and then said, "He called my mom. He's apparently trying to reach you through anyone who might have your current number." And I felt my jaw tighten as I responded, "I'm not helping him. He made his choices, and now he gets to live with them." But even as I said it, I was pulling up the bankruptcy documents again, studying the list of creditors and the proposed reorganization plan that would never work, because it relied on revenue projections that were completely unrealistic for a company that had lost 90% of its clients. I spent the weekend researching bankruptcy law and looking at similar cases, telling myself I was just curious, just trying to understand the process, definitely not looking for solutions or ways the company might be saved. And by Monday morning, I'd admitted to myself what I'd known since I first saw the filing. There was no reorganization plan that would work. Chen Mortgage Solutions was going to be liquidated, and everything my father had built over 30 years was going to be sold off to pay creditors who'd get maybe 30 cents on the dollar. The bankruptcy court scheduled the first creditors' meeting for March 15th, exactly 1 month away, and I marked the date in my calendar, though I told myself I was just tracking it for industry interest, not because I was planning anything, not because an idea was forming in the back of my mind that I wasn't quite ready to examine in the full light of consciousness. The idea that had been forming in the back of my mind finally crystallized on March 1st, 2 weeks before the scheduled creditors' meeting. And once I allowed myself to actually examine it, I couldn't let it go. I could buy my father's company out of bankruptcy, acquire everything he'd built for pennies on the dollar, and the symmetry of it was almost too perfect to resist. I spent 3 days running numbers with my CFO, looking at what Chen Mortgage Solutions had been versus what it was now. And the analysis was brutally clear. The company had good clients who were leaving only because of outdated systems and poor management. The brand still had recognition in the market, even if that recognition was fading, and the physical assets, client lists, licensing, existing contracts, were worth more than the liquidation value the bankruptcy court would get. My CFO asked, "Why would you want to buy a failing mortgage brokerage when we build software?" And I said carefully, "Because with our platform integrated, those clients would stay, and we'd have a proof of concept for a hybrid model, tech platform plus human broker service." Which was true, but wasn't the whole truth. And she nodded slowly and said, "It could work. The purchase price would be low enough that even if it failed, we wouldn't be badly hurt." And I said, "Run a full due diligence analysis. I want to know everything about that company's finances and client relationships." The due diligence took a week and confirmed what I'd suspected. My father had run the company into the ground through a combination of refusing to modernize, letting Brett make terrible decisions, and taking on debt to maintain appearances rather than cutting costs strategically. But underneath the mismanagement was a fundamentally sound client base and operational structure that could be saved with proper leadership and technology integration. I looked at the final report on March 10th, 5 days before the creditors' meeting, and I knew I was going to do it, even though I couldn't fully articulate why. Was it revenge? Wanting to own the thing my father had valued more than me? Or was it something more complicated? A twisted form of rescue that let me be in control? Or was it actually a sound business decision that just happened to involve my father? I called my lawyer and said, I want to submit a bid to acquire Chen Mortgage Solutions through the bankruptcy proceeding. How do we do that? And he was quiet for a moment before asking, Maya, isn't that your father's company? And I said flatly, it's a bankrupt company that happens to have been owned by someone I'm related to. Can you handle this, or do I need different counsel? He said he could handle it, and I spent the next 4 days preparing an acquisition offer. $350,000 cash for all assets, assumption of certain contracts, but not the debt. And I would retain only 2 of the 3 remaining employees. My father would not be one of them. The bankruptcy court scheduled a creditors' meeting for March 15th at 2:00 p.m. in the downtown courthouse, and I cleared my calendar for the afternoon and told my team I had an important meeting but didn't specify what kind. Driving to the courthouse alone because this felt like something I needed to do by myself without witnesses or support. I arrived 30 minutes early and sat in my car reviewing the acquisition documents one final time. The formal offer that my lawyer would present that would transfer ownership of Chen Mortgage Solutions to a subsidiary of FinFlow Solutions for $350,000 cash. And my hands were shaking slightly as I held the papers, because this was real now. I was actually going to walk into that courtroom and make an offer to buy my father's entire life's work out from under him. I finally went inside at 1:50 p.m. and found the correct courtroom. A small, depressing space with fluorescent lights and worn carpet that smelled like old documents and desperation. And there were maybe 15 people scattered across the benches. Creditors' lawyers, mostly. A few individuals who were owed money, the bankruptcy trustee reviewing files at a table, and in the front row sitting alone was my father. He looked smaller than he had in my office 6 weeks ago, wearing a suit that hung loose on his frame like he'd lost more weight. And his hands were clasped between his knees and his head was bowed, and he looked like a man who'd already accepted defeat. And for just a moment, I felt a stab of something that might have been pity, or might have been grief for what could have been if he'd been a different father, or I'd been a different daughter. He sensed someone watching, and looked up, and our eyes met across the courtroom. And I watched recognition and shock and confusion cross his face as he registered that I was here, that his daughter, who wouldn't return his calls, was sitting in the back row of his bankruptcy hearing, and he half stood like he was going to approach me, but my lawyer appeared at my elbow and said quietly, "It's time. Are you ready?" And I nodded and said, "I'm ready." And my father's face shifted from confusion to understanding as he saw the lawyer and the documents and realized why I was here. The bankruptcy trustee called the meeting to order and began with procedural statements about the case and the assets available for distribution, and the fact that they'd received one formal offer for acquisition of the company as a going concern, and my father's head whipped around to stare at the trustee and then back at me. And I could see him working through it, understanding that the offer was mine, that I was here to buy everything he'd built, and his expression was so complicated, shame and shock, and something that might have been pride mixed with devastation, that I had to look away. The trustee proceeded methodically through the details of the bankruptcy filing, reading from documents in a flat, bureaucratic tone that made my father's entire life's work sound like nothing more than a series of failed transactions and unpaid obligations, and the creditor's lawyers asked procedural questions about timelines and payment priorities, while my father sat silent and still, and I watched the back of his head and felt nothing like the triumph I'd expected to feel at this moment. When the trustee finally said, We have received one offer to acquire the business as a going concern, and I'll now review the terms. My father's shoulders visibly tensed, and I saw his hands grip the edge of the bench in front of him, and the trustee continued. The offer is from FinFlow Solutions, a financial technology company based downtown, for $350,000 cash, all assets including client lists and existing contracts, no assumption of debt beyond what's specified in the attached schedule, and retention of 2 current employees with positions to be determined by the acquiring company. One of the creditor's lawyers asked, "Is the purchaser here today?" And my lawyer stood and said, "I represent FinFlow Solutions, yes." And the trustee said, "The offer is substantially above liquidation value and would allow for better creditor recovery, so unless there are objections or competing offers, I'm inclined to recommend approval." And my father finally turned around fully in his seat to stare at me with an expression of such naked devastation that I had to look down at my hands. The same creditor's lawyer who'd asked the question said, "I'd like to note for the record that this is an excellent outcome for creditors. My client supports the acquisition." And 2 other lawyers murmured agreement, and the trustee said, "Mr. Chen, do you have any objection to this offer?" And the entire room went silent, waiting for my father to respond. And I looked up and met his eyes across the courtroom, and saw him actually understand in that moment what was happening. That his daughter, whom he'd called useless, was buying his dying company, that everything he'd built would belong to me, that I had become successful enough to purchase his failure. He opened his mouth, and I thought he was going to object, going to make a scene, going to say something that would force me to humiliate him further by having my lawyer detail exactly why his company was worthless without my intervention, but instead he just said quietly, "No objection." And his voice cracked on the second word, and he turned back around to face the front, and his shoulders slumped in complete defeat. The trustee said, "Then I'll recommend approval to the judge. We'll schedule a final hearing for next week barring any complications, and this meeting is adjourned." And people began gathering papers and standing and talking in low voices. And my father sat completely still in the front row, not moving while the room emptied around him. And I stood slowly, and my lawyer said, "That went well. I'll prepare the final documents." And I nodded, but couldn't take my eyes off my father's back. My lawyer gathered her materials and left with the other creditors' representatives, while I remained in my seat watching my father sit alone in the front row of the empty courtroom. And for several long minutes neither of us moved, and I thought maybe I should just leave without speaking to him, let the lawyers handle everything from here, make this purely transactional and professional and clean. But something kept me in that seat, maybe unfinished business, or maybe just the need to see his face when we spoke now that the power dynamic had completely reversed. Now that I held his entire life's work in my hands, the way he'd once held my future in his and chose to throw it away. And finally, I stood and walked down the aisle toward him, and my footsteps echoed in the quiet room. He heard me approaching and turned slowly, and up close he looked even worse than he had from the back of the courtroom, his face deeply lined and his eyes bloodshot like he hadn't been sleeping. And when he looked at me, his expression was so raw and unguarded that I almost felt sorry for him before I remembered 18-year-old Maya standing on the sidewalk with a duffel bag. "You're buying my company," he said. And it wasn't a question, just a statement of fact that he was still trying to process, and I nodded once and said, "Yes, my company is acquiring the assets," keeping my voice professional and distant, like this was just another business transaction. He looked down at his hands and said quietly, "I built that company from nothing, worked for 30 years to make it successful." And I felt a flash of anger and replied, "And I built my company from nothing too, except I actually had nothing when I started. Just $200 and the clothes in a duffel bag, remember?" He flinched like I'd slapped him and said, "Maya, I know I hurt you. I know I made terrible mistakes." And I waited for more, for the actual apology, for the acknowledgement of exactly what he'd done. But he just trailed off and looked at me with those defeated eyes like his suffering now somehow erased what he'd done to me then. Why are you buying it? He asked finally. And his voice was small and confused, and I realized he genuinely didn't understand, couldn't see that this was both justice and irony, the useless daughter saving the father's legacy. And I said carefully, because it's a good business acquisition, the client list has value, and two of your employees are excellent at their jobs, and because I can integrate it into my platform and actually make it profitable again. He shook his head slowly and said, That's the business reason, but why really? Are you doing this to hurt me? To humiliate me? Because if you want revenge. And I cut him off sharply. This isn't about you, Dad. Just like my success was never about you. I built my company because I'm good at what I do, and I'm buying yours because it makes financial sense. Your ego doesn't factor into my business decisions. The word dad felt strange in my mouth after so many years of not saying it, and I saw him react to it. Saw something like hope flicker in his eyes, and I realized I needed to be very clear about what this was and wasn't. This is a business transaction, I said firmly, and my voice came out harder than I intended, but I needed him to understand, needed to draw a clear boundary before he got confused about what was happening here. I'm buying the assets of a bankrupt company because they have value that I can leverage. And yes, I'm retaining two of your employees, because Tom and Sarah are excellent at their jobs, and they deserve better than to lose their livelihoods because of your mismanagement. But this doesn't mean we have a relationship now. It doesn't mean I've forgiven you. And it definitely doesn't mean you get to be part of my life just because I'm purchasing your company. He looked like I'd punched him in the stomach, and he said quietly, I understand this is business, but Maya, you have to know that watching you succeed has made me realize how wrong I was about you, how wrong I was about everything. And I felt that familiar anger rising because he still didn't get it, still thought this was about proving something to him. I didn't succeed to show you anything, I said, and I stood up because I needed the physical advantage, needed to be looking down at him instead of sitting while we talked, and I continued. I succeeded because I'm talented, and I work hard, and I refuse to let your cruelty define me. I built my company for me, not for you, and if watching me succeed made you realize you were wrong, that's your problem to deal with, not something I need to help you process. He stood too, more slowly, and he looked at me with such naked regret that for a moment I saw the father he'd been when I was very young, before Mom died, when he used to help me with homework and call me his smart girl, and that memory hurt worse than anything because it reminded me of what I'd lost. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said, and his voice was shaking now. I know I destroyed our relationship, and I threw away the best thing in my life when I threw you out. But Maya, you're my daughter. You're my only child, and I'm asking if there's any way we could try to. And I cut him off because I couldn't let him finish that sentence, couldn't let him ask for something I wasn't sure I could refuse if he actually said the words. I have a daughter? I said, and I let the question hang there, and he looked confused and said, Yes, you're my. And I shook my head and said, No, I'm asking you, do you have a daughter? Because last I checked, you had a stepson named Brett, who you gave everything to, and you had a burden who you threw out like garbage, but I'm not sure you ever really had a daughter. The words came out cold and precise, and I watched them hit him like physical blows, watched his face crumble. And part of me felt vindicated while another part felt sick, because I'd never been cruel before, had never wanted to hurt someone deliberately, but he'd taught me that lesson along with all the others. He was silent for a long moment after my words hit him, and I watched his face cycle through emotions, shock and pain, and then something that looked almost like understanding, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear it. You're right. I never treated you like a daughter, not after your mother died, and Brett got everything while you got nothing, and I told myself I was preparing you for the real world, while I was really just punishing you for not being the son I wanted, for reminding me of your mother, for being one more thing I couldn't control after I lost her. The honesty of it surprised me, shocked me actually, because in all our interactions, he'd never been this direct, this willing to name what he'd done. And I felt something shift in my chest, but I couldn't tell if it was softening or just a different kind of pain. And I said carefully, "Why are you telling me this now?" He looked up at me, and his eyes were wet, and he said, "Because I'm 63 years old, and my company is gone, and my wife left me 6 months ago, and Brett is in rehab and won't speak to me, and I'm sitting in a bankruptcy courtroom watching my only child, my daughter who I threw away, buy my entire life's work, and I realize that I don't have anything left except the truth. So that's what I'm giving you. The truth is that I was cruel to you. I was wrong about you, and you deserved so much better than what I gave you." I sat down slowly because my legs felt unsteady, and I said, "Linda left?" And he nodded and said, "Took half of what little I had left, and moved to Arizona with some guy she met online. And Brett blames me for his problems, and maybe he's right too. I gave him everything and taught him nothing, just like I gave you nothing and you taught yourself everything." We sat in silence for a moment, him in the front row and me 1 row behind, and I processed what he'd said, this thing that was closer to an apology than anything he'd ever given me before, but still wasn't quite an apology, more like an explanation, a context for his cruelty that didn't excuse it, but at least acknowledged it. "I don't know what you want me to say," I told him finally, and my voice came out tired instead of angry, exhausted from 14 years of carrying this weight. And he turned in his seat to look at me and said, "I don't want you to say anything. I just want you to know that I see you now. I see what you built and who you are and how strong you had to be to survive what I did to you. And I know I can't fix it, can't take back the damage, but I need you to know that I'm sorry, truly sorry for all of it." There it was, the actual apology, the words I'd needed for so long, and I waited to feel relief or vindication or closure, but instead, I just felt hollow, empty, because the apology came too late and from a broken man who only found wisdom in his own destruction. And I realized that nothing he said now could heal the 18-year-old girl who stood on that sidewalk, that some wounds don't heal just because someone finally acknowledges they caused them. I looked at my father sitting in that courtroom pew with his shoulders slumped and his face showing every one of his 63 years, and I realized that I didn't feel the vindication I'd expected to feel, didn't feel the righteous satisfaction I'd imagined during all those years when I fantasized about proving him wrong, and instead I just felt tired, so incredibly tired of carrying this weight, and I said quietly, "An apology doesn't fix 14 years. It doesn't give me back the father I needed when I was 18 and terrified. And it doesn't heal the girl who worked herself to exhaustion because she internalized your message that she was worthless." He nodded slowly and said, "I know that. I know I can't fix it. But Maya, is there any possibility that we could start over? That we could build something new even if I destroyed what we had?" And I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. This man who threw me away asking if we could just start fresh like none of it had happened. But instead I said, "I don't know if I have that in me. I don't know if I can separate the father you were from the father you are now, and I don't know if you've actually changed or if you're just broken and alone and reaching for whatever connection you can find." The honesty of my words seemed to surprise both of us, and he said, "That's fair. That's more than fair. And I don't blame you for questioning my motives, because my timing is terrible, coming back into your life now when I've lost everything. But Maya, I've been going to therapy since Linda left, been working on understanding why I was so cruel to you. And my therapist helped me see that I was angry at your mother for dying, angry at myself for not saving her. And I took it out on you because you looked like her, reminded me of her, made me face my grief every time I looked at you." I processed this information, this explanation that contextualized his cruelty without excusing it, and I said, "I'm glad you're in therapy. I'm glad you're working on yourself. But Dad, I needed you to work on yourself 14 years ago. I needed you to be a father instead of a grieving husband who couldn't see past his own pain, and I can't applaud you for doing the bare minimum of self-reflection after you've already destroyed our relationship." He flinched at my words but didn't argue, and I continued. I'm buying your company because it's a good business decision and because Tom and Sarah deserve job security. But I don't know if I can give you anything beyond that. I don't know if I can be your daughter again, or if that door is closed forever, and I need you to accept that this might be all we ever have. This conversation in a courtroom after everything fell apart. He sat there processing my words, this boundary I was setting that said I might never be able to give him what he wanted. And I watched something like grief cross his face. The realization that some consequences are permanent, that some relationships once broken can't be repaired, no matter how much you want to fix them. And he said quietly, I understand. I understand that I don't deserve your forgiveness or your trust. And I understand that showing up now after everything fell apart makes it look like I only care because I need something. But Maya, I want you to know that I've thought about you every day for 14 years, wondered if you were okay, if you were happy, if you hated me as much as I deserved to be hated. I felt something crack in my chest at those words, this admission that I'd lived in his thoughts, even as he lived in mine, and I said, if you thought about me every day, you could have called. You could have reached out before you lost everything. You could have apologized when it might have meant something, instead of when you have nothing left to lose. He nodded slowly and said, you're right, I should have. But I was ashamed, Maya. I was so ashamed of what I'd done, and the older you got, and the more successful you became, the more ashamed I felt. And I told myself you were better off without me, that I'd already done enough damage, and I should just leave you alone. I laughed bitterly and said, so you made it about you, made your guilt more important than my need for a father, and you're still doing it. Still centering yourself in this story, instead of actually hearing what I'm telling you. The harshness of my words made him flinch, but I continued, because I needed him to understand. I spent years thinking I was worthless because you told me I was. I worked myself to exhaustion trying to prove you wrong. I built an entire company partly because I needed to show that I wasn't useless. And now you want me to comfort you about your shame, to absolve you of your guilt so you can feel better about yourself. He was quiet for a long moment and then he said, no, you're right. I'm sorry. I'm still making this about me when it should be about acknowledging what I did to you. And I felt surprised by this, by his ability to hear my criticism and actually adjust instead of getting defensive. And I wondered if maybe therapy really had changed him, or if desperation had finally made him capable of actual self-reflection. The bailiff returned and said, Judge is ready, 5 minutes. And I stood up, smoothed my suit, became CEO Maya instead of wounded daughter Maya, and my father stood too and said, Maya, regardless of what happens with us, I want you to know that I'm genuinely proud of you, not because you're successful, but because you're kind and strong, and you became an incredible person, despite having me as a father. And those words hit me harder than anything else he'd said, because for the first time in my life, I heard him express pride in who I was, rather than what I'd accomplished. We walked back into the courtroom and I sat at the petitioner's table while my father returned to his seat in the gallery. And the judge entered, and everyone stood, and then sat again. And the bankruptcy trustee presented my offer of $450,000 for the assets of Chen Mortgage Solutions, including all client contracts and the company name, and the judge reviewed the documents and asked if there were any other bidders, and there was silence in the courtroom, and then the judge looked at my father and said, Mr. Chen, you understand that this sale means you will no longer own or operate your company? And my father stood and said, Yes, Your Honor, I understand. And his voice was steady, but I could hear the grief underneath it. And the judge said, And you have no objection to the sale to FinFlow Solutions? And my father looked directly at me for a long moment and then said, No objection, Your Honor. My daughter built a good company, and she'll take care of my employees better than I did. And hearing him call me his daughter in that official setting, acknowledging our relationship in front of the judge and the lawyers and Tom and Sarah, made something twist in my chest, and the judge nodded and said, Very well, The court approves the sale of assets to FinFlow Solutions for $450,000, and Mr. Chen's remaining debts will be discharged under Chapter 7 after the sale proceeds are distributed to creditors. And just like that, it was over. 14 years of struggle and pain and success, culminating in this moment where I bought my father's dying company in a bankruptcy courtroom. I signed the final documents, and Tom and Sarah both hugged me, and Tom said, "Thank you for believing in us." And Sarah said, "Your father raised a good person, even if he didn't realize it." And I felt tears threaten but held them back. And then Tom and Sarah left, and it was just me and my father and the lawyers packing up their briefcases. And my father approached slowly and said, "Maya, thank you. You didn't have to save the company or keep Tom and Sarah employed, but you did." And I said, "I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because Tom and Sarah deserve better than to lose their jobs because of your mistakes." And he nodded and said, "I know, but still, thank you." And we stood there in awkward silence, and then I said, "I meant what I said before. I don't know if I can ever be your daughter again. But maybe we could try coffee sometime, just to talk, no expectations." And the hope that flooded his face was almost painful to see, and he said, "I would like that very much, whenever you're ready, no pressure." And I nodded and turned to leave, and then stopped and turned back and said, "Dad, for what it's worth, I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace, and I can't have peace while I'm carrying all this anger." And his eyes filled with tears, and he said, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it. And Maya, I am so incredibly proud of who you became." And I walked out of that courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, feeling lighter than I had in 14 years. Not because everything was fixed or because we suddenly had a perfect relationship, but because I had finally proven to myself that I was never useless, that I had worth independent of his approval, and that I could choose grace without compromising my boundaries. And as I drove back to my office, I thought about 18-year-old Maya standing on the sidewalk with a duffel bag and $200, and I wished I could tell her that everything would be okay, that she would build something amazing, that she would survive and thrive, and eventually find peace. And I touched the gold necklace with my mother's initial and said quietly, "We did it, Mom. We proved him wrong, and we're going to be okay."